If you have ever wondered why your page load speeds matter, how Google sees your site, or what makes one website blazing fast while another feels sluggish, you're in the right place. In this part, we're going to break down what exactly are static and dynamic rendering, why choosing the right one can make or break your user experience, how to implement them using the latest Next.js. Whether you're building a blog, an e-commerce store, or a SaaS dashboard, mastering these rendering methods will help you create faster, more SEO-friendly and scalable apps. So buckle up, let's dive into what static and dynamic rendering really means in modern development. Now that we have already covered the fundamentals of rendering in our previous topics, including client-side and server-side rendering, let's build on that foundation. Just so you are aware, static rendering and dynamic rendering are not separate categories altogether. They are actually subtypes of server-side rendering right here. That means in both cases, the HTML content is generated in the server before sending it to the browser. It just depends on when and how that HTML is generated. Therefore, it's important to keep in mind that both static and dynamic rendering fall under the same server-side rendering. So what exactly are static rendering and dynamic rendering? Let's break it down. Static rendering, also known as static site generation, is when the HTML is generated at build time. That means the content is pre-rendered and stored as static files on a CDN or a server. When a user visits a page, it's delivered instantly, super fast and highly efficient, especially for content that does not change often like blogs or documentation. On the other hand, we have dynamic rendering, which happens on each request. So whenever a user visits a page, the server generates fresh HTML in real time, usually based on a user-specific data or the latest content. So to put into simple words, static rendering is like preparing meals ahead of time and storing them in the fridge, quick to serve, while dynamic rendering is like cooking fresh on the spot, slower but tailored and always up to date. Both approaches have their own pros and cons, and choosing the right one really depends on the needs of your web and website. Now you might be wondering, why does choosing the right rendering method even matter? Well, the rendering method that you choose can directly affect the performance, user experience, and even SEO. Let's say you are building a blog or a documentation site. Static rendering would be ideal here because the content doesn't change often and users get super fast load times. But if building something like a dashboard that needs real-time data or a user-specific page like a profile page or an admin panel, then dynamic rendering makes more sense right here because the content is always fresh and tailored for the user. So here are the key metrics which we can use to decide on which particular rendering methods to choose from. So if your website's speed really matters, hands down, static rendering is a choice. The faster the website loads, the more likely users are to stay and engage with it. Slow websites can frustrate users and lead to a higher bounce rates, while fast loading pages help keep people around longer. Search engines also care about rendering. For content-heavy websites like blogs, articles, or documentation, how your pages are rendered can affect how well they are indexed by the search engines. A properly rendered page makes it easier for search engines to understand and rank your content. And lastly, scalability is also an important factor. Static pages are often much easier and cheaper to scale because they don't require the server to do any extra work each time someone visits, unlike dynamic rendering, which regenerates content on the fly. Static pages can handle large volumes of traffic more efficiently. So at the end of the day, it's all about choosing the method that aligns best with your project's needs, content type, and performance goals. Now that we have talked about what static and dynamic rendering are, let's look at how they are actually implemented in code. So on the left side right here, we have static rendering. In this example, we are fetching data from an API with this line, the first line right here. Then the key part here is revalidate equals to false, which tells the system not to revalidate or update the data once it's built. This means the content is generated ahead of time and remains the same until we manually update it. Perfect for pages that rarely change. On the right hand side right here, we see dynamic rendering. The fetch call looks similar, but here we are using cache equals to no store, which means we are saying always fetch fresh data, don't cache anything. This ensures that every single request pulls the latest data from the server, making it ideal for highly dynamic content like live dashboards or user-specific data. So even though both approaches are fetching the data, the configuration you use makes all the difference in how the page is rendered and served. Now let's see both of this implementation in action. Let's start with static rendering first. So in our code, this particular function fetches for the user data from an API, and I'll be adding a timestamp which would eventually can be used to know exactly when was this particular page was rendered. So I'll be adding paragraph tag like this, and inside here I'll be adding date, a date function. Okay, and this date function must be converted to string, so I must put to local time string. So in this one, it would eventually look for the current time, and it will convert to time right here. So what I'll be doing right now, I'll be building this particular project, and just to see how will this particular project will behave on production. So I'll be going to this terminal right here, and I'll be stopping the current process. So in this case, I'll be building the project using npm run build. And there you go. Right now, the project has been built for production. So all we need to do, we just need to start this production server by typing npm start. And we need to go to this particular URL. And there you go. Right now, we're able to see the code that we have just built. And right now, we're able to see the timestamp right here. And these are the users that are able to be fetched from the API. So when I hit refresh, as you can see, nothing actually happens, or like this particular timestamp doesn't updates. The reason being is because the page was statically generated during the build process. So which makes it doesn't rerun the code every time when a user visits the page. And this means that the page is actually going through caching. So in contrast to the second implementation, which is the dynamic rendering. So in dynamic rendering, we'll need to add this particular cache equals to node store. So back to our code right here. In this case, we're going to be adding just a small change right here. In this case, the change is going to be inside the API right here. And I'll be adding cache equals to no store. So what does it do is that we are telling Next.js to not to cache this page, which forces this to run the server-side logic on every request. So let's build this exact same project again. And run build. And let's run the production server as well. Now, in this particular production server, as you can see, when I hit refresh, this particular timestamp gets updated every single time when I hit refresh. So what does this means is that this confirms that the page is dynamically rendered on the server, because it's actually fetching every single time when we refresh the page, which means for every single request that has been a new fresh request directly to the server, which means there's no caching has happened. And this makes this particular dynamic rendering special because it always fetches a new and fresh data. And this shows that the page will always re-render on every request because we are using dynamic rendering. Let's quickly wrap things up with a summary to help you choose the right rendering method based on your goals. If your main goal is speed, then static rendering is the best bet. Pre-rendered pages load almost instantly because they are already generated and ready to go. For SEO, static rendering also comes out on the top because search engines love fast-loading, stable pages with consistent content, and static pages deliver exactly that. However, when you need personalization, like showing different content to different users, then dynamic rendering becomes essential. It allows you to tailor each response based on who's visiting the page. So similarly, if your app relies on real-time updates such as live notification or constantly changing the data, dynamic rendering is the way to go. And finally, for scalability, static rendering wins again. So since pages are pre-built and your app can handle much more traffic without straining your server resources. So the choice really depends on your priorities. Speed and scalability, go for static. And needs flexibility and real-time data, go for dynamic.